Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you, Zishan and Idris and everybody else in Paderborn for inviting me to this conference. And I'm terribly sorry that I'm not able to attend in present. Unfortunately, I've been struggling with a COVID infection, and that's the same reason why I need to apologize now that I'm still having coughing attacks that I may need a break in between. I hope to go through without one, but you never seem to know. At least in the rehearsal of this speech, I had multiple ones, so let's hope for the best. I am in the same vein, while I'm already apologizing, I need to apologize to Aaron, who's supposed to respond to my presentation, and I haven't provided him anything. So the poor guy is listening right now and is going to respond on his feet. I'm very sorry, and I hope you will be kind in judging him and his response. My presentation is actually threefold. So one part I would like to talk about is the broader context of Islamic theology in Germany. I think this is necessary in order to understand how one can build the relation to comparative studies. And the second one is more precisely about the comparative theology itself. And the third one is then to sort of sketch out what I understand, what I'm trying to do in my work comparatively. It is important to acknowledge the support of Christian theologians and religious studies scholars when we tell the story of Islamic theology, how Islamic theology came to be established in the landscape of German academia. At the same time, however, Islamic theology hasn't entered a vacuum. It still has to navigate itself through structures that developed well before its own birth, but still profoundly shape the conditions in which Islamic theology is unfolding today. Let me clarify this with an example. In the moment where I designate myself as an Islamic theologian, I'm immediately conceived within a pre-existing paradigm in which theology is given a particular place and role in the university. Critically evaluating this positionality, I would like to at least question what Klaus von Stosch, for instance, echoed yesterday in his keynote. Is theology really conceived by the other sciences as a contributing factor to their own disciplinary research? While we can hardly escape the narrative about the critical importance of interdisciplinarity, I seldom notice actual interdisciplinary work. Instead, I encounter very often a keen sense to draw disciplinary borders and boundaries. I'm wondering how much the ideal of the university, as it was portrayed by Klaus von Stosch yesterday, a place where one's own discipline is challenged through engagement with the other disciplines, is a lived reality. Often I find myself being put in categories which I haven't actively chosen to be part of. It is not my understanding of what theology entails that shapes their idea about me. It is mostly their understanding of what theology, and in that vein almost exclusively what Christian theology means, that predetermines my status. This categorization, on the other hand, is largely fueled by the way in which Christian theologies have developed. Their particular struggles and challenges have shaped this positionality as much as their questions and inquiries. I may not be part of that past, but I'm certainly affected by the status quo. So I'm wondering how much of that history of Christian theology in Germany and German universities actually speaks to me. Can I see myself somewhere in it? Is there any way for me to locate some of my own priorities within that history? While there might be some overlap between the questions that Christian theologians struggled with and my own questions today, I'm often also overwhelmed by the differences, prompting the question how I can overcome the agendas that are presented to me as given. To use one very emblematic metaphor that was once presented by Farid Esak during a conference in Paderborn, when am I going to be allowed to operate the steering wheel of the car, leaving behind my status as a passenger only? Esak even said that at times he has been awarded a front seat passenger status from previously being seated in the back of the car, so there's some sort of evolvement, progress, but he was still denied control over the car. I mean, this is by no means new. The scientific board that had recommended the emergence of Islamic theology chairs in Germany was well aware of the circumstantial challenges that existed And I totally agree that opting for pragmatic choices here and there was necessary to get things off the ground. Inherent to this process, however, was also the acknowledgement that this emerging field had to develop its own terminologies, but also a critical lens. Therefore, when I point out to existing asymmetries between Islamic theology and Christian theologies, I'm engaging in that critical process of locating hierarchies, privileges, and existing structural frameworks. I don't do this in order to point fingers at individuals or the field of Christian theology as a whole. I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm also not blaming or accusing anyone either, but I'm simply asking us to critically reflect upon these issues together. As much as I'm aware of the structural differences that affect my work, at the same time, I'm aware, for instance, that asymmetries also exist within Islamic theology itself. 10 years after the establishment, we still don't have a single chair for Shi'i theology, for instance, to name one pressing issue. In my opinion, turning our attention for one moment to the issue of language is a very effective demonstration of how the inherent asymmetries work. I mentioned above the strings that are attached to using the designation theology. Again, this is not news. Entering the field of theology means employing a linguistic map that has been largely shaped by other theologies. A distinctive theological thinking has come to imprint itself onto the language. I'm reminded of that time and again when I'm tempted to use technical terms such as revelation, faith, or hope. Now, it is not entirely impossible to deconstruct these terminologies and reconstruct them along one's own sensitivities, making space for one's own intellectual heritage. But anyone engaging in this process knows how difficult, challenging, exhausting, and discouraging this can be. Sometimes it feels like there is no breathing room, and while you spend a lot of time carving out that space, you realize you don't have much energy left to substantiate your claims. On the other hand, the conference, for instance, is entitled Defining Islamic Comparative Theology. My chair is designated Comparative Theology from an Islamic Perspective. I ask myself, where does the blueprint for these designations come from? How would I designate my research? And the response I would give to that is, I see myself more in a traditional line of culture that's called adab al-bahth wal-munadara, the art of the culture of investigation and discourse. And I'm not trying to argue to Islamicize designations, but I'm arguing that employing language, creating categories, establish hierarchies and dependencies. You can easily find yourself stuck in a position where you keep responding to the intellectual or theological questions and agendas of others. This can become particularly frustrating when it turns into a one-way street. As much as engaging with others under the precincts of their questions can yield compelling insights, I'm wondering whether there can be a sustainable relationship. Returning to the intricate purpose of language. Now, you could, of course, adopt the existing linguistic culture and introduce modifications that fit your needs. Or you could decide to fight an uphill battle and attempt to reconfigure the language to your needs. While at it, the latter option could also give us a chance to think about how, in this process as Muslim theologians, we could also tackle the challenge of translating our theological tradition into a secular language, so that our theological tradition could also, at least to some point, become a public theology. Realistically, however, and that seems to be the status quo, Muslim theologians will employ a mixture of both, adopting the linguistic culture at times and expanding it elsewhere. However, as much as Muslims are absorbing the linguistic culture, it also requires others to be open to changes and reconfigurations. All in all, not an easy task. 2, thinking about comparative theology. Bearing all of this in mind, thinking about comparative theology now resembles a particular challenge. Despite the many conflicts that the monotheistic traditions in particular had with one another, it seems critically important to emphasize that this history is also a history filled with constructive engagements with one another, at points decisively advancing theological reasoning. One could therefore argue that doing comparative theology is nothing new, but already underlies not only the history of monotheistic theologies, but also the history of theological traditions worldwide. Comparative theology, as a theological subdivision, as a field of study, on the other hand, needs to be distinguished here. It is a rather young discipline, employing a clear-cut methodology, emerged in the Western Hemisphere and almost exclusively advanced by Christian theologians in the beginning. Comparative theology first became established at the end of the 20th century at theological institutions in the US and is primarily associated with the names of the Catholic theologians Catherine Cornell and Francis Clooney. The fruitful implementation of comparative theology in the German-speaking world, on the other hand, is closely connected with the work of Klaus von Stosch. Not only did he succeed in exploring a theological tradition that had become established at the American universities, he also promoted a decisive development. While Cornell and Clooney primarily dealt with Buddhism and Hinduism respectively, Klaus von Stosch succeeded in intensifying the exchange between Christian and Islamic theology in cooperation with Muslim theologians. He describes the programmatic approach of comparative theology as a field of multiple tangents. He emphasizes that the theologian embarking on this path ought to be courageous because comparative theology has a global claim, not only bringing together all theological traditions, but to show equal appreciation to all of them, and simultaneously to shed one's own theological traditions if they are in the way of celebrating one another. Methodological questions, therefore, assume a critical role in the implementation of comparative theology. Methodology not only helps individual scholars determine their hermeneutical approach to other religious traditions, it also provides a rationale for the normative mission of comparative theology. Particularly important in this context is a differentiation from approaches that merely diagnose a pluralistic tradition without formulating a precise methodology for how to think about the relationship among the various traditions of thought, or how to moderate conflicts because of conflicting beliefs and truth claims. Proponents of comparative theology, therefore, seek to understand the other in its otherness by exposing oneself to that otherness. Establishing a dynamic, reciprocal communication and recognition between theological tradition is yet another goal. The intention behind this is to nurture a space that enables recognition and learning processes between different theological traditions. Its consistent advocacy for one's own truth claims, as much as the claims of the other, is seen as the central cornerstone to the challenge of religious diversity. Comparative theology is a very prudent attempt to respond to the perceived challenge of religious and theological plurality in the world. The questions brought forward are: how can the plurality of religious truth claims be reconciled? How can theologians remain faithful to their own truth claims while appreciating those others in their otherness and their faith? The framework in which these questions are negotiated is thus set in a very particular context. This leads me to critically evaluate my own positionality. Now, the question I ask myself is whether my epistemological curiosity actually aligns with this outlook. Am I, as a Muslim theologian, interested in reconciling the various truth claims? I'm inclined to say no. Obviously, I too am holding truth claims. However, I'm not driven by a desire to defend this truth claim or detect it in other traditions. Thomas Bauer speaks about the suspension of the truth claim in Islamic tradition, yielding to a culture of ambiguity instead. I'm also not concerned by crafting a grand theory that could explain it all, that could incorporate the variety and plurality of the world, that could make sense of the various idiosyncrasies, ambivalences, and ambiguities of the world. As a matter of fact, I found myself to be perfectly happy with uncertainties with regard to both the world and God. I live in a state of fear and hope, khawf wa raja. Are these aspects of comparative theology that I find appealing? Yes, very much so. Abandoning patterns in favor of a role that is not only benevolent, but also appreciative of the other theological traditions is one to name among many. The concept of epistemological humility is extremely appealing, and so is the concept of a willingness to learn from the other. These are important facets of comparative theology. However, they do not simply exist in a detached context. They are framed within a specific disciplinary approach. And personally, I don't find that specific framework to be aligning with my own priorities. I want to point out my agency here. I think it is important to underline the fact that Muslim theologians do engage and are part of comparative theology studies, and that they advance not only the area of the field, but they also provide innovative approaches to Islamic thought. I, on the other hand, find myself increasingly in a position where I set my priority in finding my own theological voice. Obviously, this doesn't happen in a detached environment either, but at least I can use my agency to determine the framework itself. I see that as an emancipatory process that both enables me to foreground the most prominent or most important features of the Islamic tradition, but also a chance to ask myself what the Islamic tradition at the core level means to me. In other words, what am I concerned with? Navid Kermani points out that Islam derives its name from a particular act of prostration before God. It is not derived from an ethnical designation, as is Judaism, or from the divine self-revelation in Jesus, as is Christianity. This idea aptly captures my own research. I am concerned with application. I am concerned with responding to God's revelation, as it is set forth in the Quran, but also in the history that preceded it. In short, I'm concerned with practice, implementation, and realization, the act of submission itself, and the myriad ways in which that submission can be exemplified. 3. Without denying that comparative theology tradition holds many admirable and formidable insights from which anyone can benefit, and without denying that comparative theology in an Islamic perspective can positively tie in with many phenomena of current comparative theological research, I still would like to advocate for a different approach. At the heart of my understanding of theology that engages with other thought and theology traditions, therefore, lies a different emphasis that I will briefly try to sketch out here. I mentioned above that I am concerned with practice and implication. Surely, the religious tradition of Islam resembles a compilation of various threads that are woven together. At times, they are mutually dependent, or they complement each other. At other times, they stand in contrast to one another. The two threads that I found most compelling is the relationship between intellectual reflection on the one hand and religious practice or customs on the other. Obviously, this is an ancient tension, an ancient question, known to all traditions across cultures and languages. According to the Nicomachean ethics, for instance, the best human life is that which is devoted to theoretical reflection, and the second best life consists of exercising the other virtues. Which of these two options constitute for Aristotle the best human life is one of the most contested debates in the contemporary literature on Nicomachean ethics. On the one side of this debate, scholars assert that Aristotle has an inclusive view. This means that a fulfilled life requires practice in some form of both the moral and the intellectual virtues. Scholars on the other side of the debate believe that Aristotle has an exclusive or dominant view of a fulfilled life. This view claims that fulfilled life is grounded in the intellectual virtue of contemplation, which is separable from and superior to moral virtue. Aristotle himself recognizes the problem inherent in his definition. It is not possible for people to devote their lives solely to theoretical reflection. They could only do so if they were made up of some divine essence, not as living beings consisting of bodies and souls, with their respective needs. Restricting to life to theoretical reflection to an exclusive group of people would, in turn, only enable a small margin to potentially achieve the best human life. Accordingly, one could commence the enumeration of testimonials to this question within Islam as early as with the Quran, that entails numerous references about the importance of reflection and action. The Quran strongly and vehemently asks its listeners to think and reason about the creation of the world, about God itself, but also the living beings and humankind. At the same time, however, it emphasizes time and again the importance of practice, whether it be praying, fasting, or encompassing life attributes such as benevolence, grace, responsibility, hope, and so forth. The very name, Islam, submission, condenses the precept notion that this religion is emphasizing the ritual practice. It is not surprising that when Muslims think about the arkan, the pillars of Islam, 4 out of the 5 categories resemble ritual practices: praying, fasting, almsgiving, and pilgrimage. When Muslims relate to Prophet Muhammad, they relate to his actions. They seek to emulate him by attempting to do as he did. The critical hadith studies are to some extent nothing less than an expression of authenticating prophetic action. What did the Prophet really do means nothing less than what am I supposed to do today? However, as much as the importance of practice cannot be underestimated, it still is intrinsically linked to intellectual reflection. The challenge is to find the right balance. A brief survey of Islam's intellectual history may help to elucidate this point further. For instance, Al-Kindi's Risala fi Hila al-Dafd al-Ahsan does focus on a particular psychological disposition that needs to be attended to in order for the individual to attain an accomplished life. In the same way, Abu Bakr al-Razi's Tib al-Ruhani can be seen in a similar context, suggesting that an accomplished life can only be achieved when reason dominates the lower parts of the soul. This paves the way for a rational life that largely consists of the suppression of desire, anger, and other passions. Al-Farabi states in the beginning of his Tahsil al-Sada that both earthly happiness, Sada al-Dunya, and ultimate happiness, Sada al-Quswa, in the afterlife are attained through virtues, the theoretical virtue among them leading to theoretical perfection. Theoretical perfection, on the other hand, is conceived in terms of acquiring knowledge. The acquisition of knowledge, here also meaning philosophy, is according to Ibn Sina a cumulative and historically progressive process, whereby each generation will more closely approximate the perfect knowledge. Al-Ghazali departs from these highly intellectual conceptions. He identifies in his Ihya ul-Ulumuddin the aim of humans to be otherworldly happiness and Sada al-Ukhrawiyya, which can only be obtained through this life by disciplining the human passions. Kenneth Garden argues that Al-Ghazali attempted with this theory of Sada a synthesis of the science of the hereafter, a new discipline that was clearly indebted to Sufism but nowhere identified with it. Like many other Sufis, Al-Ghazali argued that rational investigation of the world rarely, if ever, brings happiness and tranquility to the investigator, whereas the knowledge and insight offered by ascetic mystical convictions and practices do. The human is initially depicted in Al-Ghazali's Kimya al-Sada as deficient and ignoble, a state that can be overcome only through strict efforts and patience, leading the soul from its deficient state to its perfection. Ibn Rushd, finally, presents a different account altogether. Criticizing the purely intellectualist account of the early philosopher, Ibn Rushd points to an inherent tension in Aristotle's account of eudaimonia, which leads to a fulfilled life, virtuous activity, or theoretical reasoning. The problem originates with Plato, who regards theoretical reasoning as the highest activity of human beings. A fulfilled life is understood to be intrinsically connected with the highest activity, meaning that the exercise of reason leads to it. This creates, however, a problem that Ibn Rushd was keen to address. On the one hand, the intellectualist conception seems to suggest that only philosophers know how to do good, and hence are the only ones to achieve happiness. On the other hand, doing good or leading a virtuous life without theoretically acknowledging underlying ethical questions, without theoretical reasoning, will not guide the human to a fulfilled life. What do I take away from this? First, while we depend on both, there ought to be a balance between intellectual curiosity and practical observance. Striking this balance is by no means an easy task, but there is the life and the works of so many who inspire us. Second, while these two entities ideally nurture one another, I detect a certain tendency in the pursuit of intellectual inquiry that one needs to be aware of. Theoretical reflection can become self-referential, detached from lived realities, or even relevance altogether. As much as indulging in theoretical reflection can yield many pleasures, at times I do find the acknowledgement of an impasse much more attractive than the ongoing investigation of it. Seeking refuge in devotional acts of worship or ritual practice, on the other hand, should not be understood as an escape or the admission to intellectual mediocrity. To the contrary, reaching out to the best of our intellectual capacities always entails the notion of existing limitations. Seeking religious practice is not only an acknowledgement of that, but it also helps us to nurture an epistemological humility towards the world. Finally, I do also realize that the conceptions underlying my practice continuously develop, and I have to constantly ask myself what it means to be just, loyal, or kind. By engaging with the world intellectually, I continue to discover new facets to the idea of justice, to friendship, to loyalty, to kindness, to forgiveness. And I see this all accomplished primarily and nurtured primarily by the terminology that I used before, adab al-bahth al-munadara, what has been termed as the discursive tradition. Essentially, the discursive tradition is understood by Tal al-Assad as a historically evolving set of discourses embodied in the practices and institutions of Islamic societies, and hence deeply integrated in the material life of those inhabiting them. One can speak of Islamic discursive tradition precisely because one can speak of a set of well-defined and universally accepted foundational texts, interpretive techniques, and practices in Islam. Assad's definition is therefore merely descriptive. It is rather normative, capturing the mode in which Islamic thought is both mediated and implemented. Assad emphasizes that the Islamic discursive tradition is characterized by its own rationality or styles of reasoning, couched in its texts, history, and institutions. This doesn't mean that there is some rationality, logic, or philosophy that is essentially Islamic and thus impenetrable to outsiders. To the contrary, certain theoretical consideration and premises emanating from the content and the form of the foundational discourses come to characterize the tradition. And so anyone wishing to argue within the Islamic tradition must start with them, even if only to argue against them. And this is now my conclusion. A guiding assumption of this paper is therefore that Islamic thought, at least in certain lines of tradition, always developed in an entwined way with prevailing ideas, both providing answers to those inquiries, as well as making an independent contribution to the corresponding debates. Consequently, the division can hardly be adopted for the intellectual history of Islam either, where religious thought was not only intrinsically connected with secular thought, but the latter also a continuous source for the appropriation of knowledge and wisdom. In this context, we cannot even speak of a mere adoption, but rather a gradual appropriation which spurred creativity and innovation within Islamic thought. I'd argue that this willingness to embrace other knowledge traditions and critically engage them, to think with and through them, is an integral part of Muslim Weltanschauung, a habitus that has been practiced throughout the intellectual history of Islam. And it therefore also lies at the core of how I understand comparative theology. This is derived from the unique nature of the Quran. Researchers point out to a specific Quranic character. The Quran is not cast as a theoretical epistle that employs rational arguments, but is full of figurative language, parables, metaphors, and visual descriptions. This framing required further elaboration and supplementation with knowledge sought outside of the Quran. Accordingly, trying to excavate, for instance, an ethical system from the Quran alone was never intended. Kevin Reinhardt proposes instead that the Quran urges us to look for ethical knowledge wherever it may be found, to assume that some part of the good enjoined by the Quran is known without revelational stipulation. It is ordinary knowledge to which the Quran refers. Exploring that knowledge through comparative theology, through a willingness to learn, and incorporating it all eventually into practice is what I deem to accomplish. Thank you very much.